panels, two broad claims in open government. One, that it allows you to challenge these stereotypes more effectively and more effectively fight them negative stereotypes in society. And two, that this gives you individual level benefit, both for your identity, but also in a more tangible manner for yourself. Firstly, what do we think that these like stereotypes are likely to look like? We think that they're objectively good stereotypes. Things like, for example, East Asian kids being smart and good at maths. Things like gay people being fashionable and so forth. We don't think that they include any negative parts that would be outside of the scope of motion. How do we think that this is likely to be done? One, we think that the parents are likely to do this in a way that is good for these children. That is to say, they're going to enforce stereotypes per the motion that these children firstly have, and they're going to allow them to embrace those ones. So if the children doesn't display any of the characteristics of that stereotype, for example, if an Asian kid is not interested in math at all, it's unlikely to occur. You're likely to do it wherever the children already display some of this. Secondly, we think that they're not likely to pressure them to take any of those identity characteristics for themselves. Why? Because we think that they understand the negative parts of it. They're just going to embrace the fact that they're displaying some of them and explain to them these are positive things that you can actually good and so on. Importantly, we think that the comparative here is that often these are our stereotypes are ways of seeing certain identity characteristics that can also be seen in negative ways. So for example, the South Asian kid can also be seen as a nerd instead of being a smart kid who is good and good because they're smart. The fact that you're being taught that you're smart and that you're good at maths and a valuable person, therefore, instead of being told that you're a nerd and cannot do social interactions, is probably good for you, because the society is likely to embrace a lot of the, or like have a lot of the negative stereotypes, and as a consequence is likely to therefore push them on you if you do not have a preconceived idea of these characteristics that you have yourself. We think that the comparative is one in which the stereotypes are far more negative. Opening.
Yeah, so in the world that the South Asian kid is good at math, do you believe that that stereotype embracing occurs in a vacuum and that no one as a result is going to call that kid a nerd or make fun of him?
I think that kid, if they're good at math, is going to be called a nerd regardless, because that is the prevailing stereotype. The point at which they're called a nerd, they can themselves believe that that is not the fair characterization of them. They can themselves believe that they're actually a smart kid and valuable kid instead of having those more problematic versions of the stereotype be put on them. Firstly, on challenging stereotypes and why this gives you additional control. We say that this allows you the kind of like narrative control on the kind of like things that are associated with your minority. That means that effectively you are able to for example, decide what kind of words are used when we describe the smartness or interest in maths. We're able to describe what kind of words are used when we talk about the willingness to be fashionable of gay individuals and so on. That this is predominantly discussed in a positive manner. The point at which these individuals themselves have learned from their parents that they believe in this in one way, or that this looks like something, they're going to also repeat that same story when they explain who they are and what their identity is about to other individuals, meaning that this narrative is going to spread into society. We think that the alternative here is one in which the majority of the society gets to define what these characteristics are. We think that the majority oftentimes is racist or complacent in racism, is problematic in the ways how they are shaping these things, and is more likely to be toxic and like focus on the more negative parts. We think that therefore, one, you get like effectively better stereotypes in general, and two, we get like individuals have the like inherent control that they deserve over how other people perceive them. Secondly, we think that you're more likely to be able to effectively question the negative parts of the stereotypes regarding your identity. Why? Because we think that in order for you to question a stereotype, especially for a kid, that requires quite a bit of active work and quite a bit of active discussion, for example, with individuals around you, in order to explain to them that what you are telling to me is hurtful, and the kind of stereotypes that you're using are very much hurtful. At the point at which the kid is able to understand that some of these stereotypes are something that they can embrace and that are positive and good for themselves, that point they can focus on questioning only the ones that are actually negative. Two impacts. One, you have simply more time and emotional resources in order to question the stereotypes that are actually negative about you, actually like you being a nerd and whatnot, meaning you're more likely to be able to tell at least the people in your like immediate circumference, in your friends and whatnot, that they should not be like calling those. Secondly, it's more believable when you're able to tell them in more detail that yes, I have these characteristics and they are seen in one way, and I believe that yeah, I have them, but they're not a negative thing like you're trying to claim. The point at which you try to do this, especially as a child, without having been taught by the parents told to embrace some parts of it, just becomes general. It becomes harder for others, especially other children, to understand how it is likely to function. Secondly, talking about the general benefits, individual level benefits to this one individual. Firstly, we think it is a benefit in terms of your identity and means you're less likely to question and be ashamed of things that are part of your identity. Recognize that we say that this primarily occurs through identity characteristics that you already have and stereotypes that are based on them, on those. We think that quite a few of these people from these groups are likely to have these identity characteristics, so this will probably be quite common, but nevertheless, that's where it happens. We say that in general, there's a pressure in society for people to be ashamed and hide these characteristics. One, because the society is often led, and the norms that we have in our media and so on are led by white and privileged individuals that want to reflect their own norms and want other people to kind of follow them, meaning you are seen as not normal, and therefore you're kind of pressured to go away from what characteristics you have. But two, because sometimes you feel that if you as a part of the minority are doing like the stereotype says, you are South Asian and East Asian and you're still smart and good doing maths and so on, it's seen as something that is bad for the minority because you're enforcing that stereotype. We think that those generally result in the fact that you're questioning your identity, especially when you're a young person, when you're a child and so on. Does CO have a POI? Okay, effectively, we think that the problem here is,
Yeah, so your case is only entirely about the kids who do feed into the stereotype. What about the millions of kids who are outside of that stereotype trying to create an identity for themselves? Do you deny them that experience generally?
Firstly, we think that there are numerous positive stereotypes about each identity group, so you can pick the one that your child is displaying. Secondly, we think this says embrace. It doesn't mean indoctrinate or force them into changing into that direction. It says that we're telling them to embrace things that they already are feeling like. We think it is literally the emotion. So we think at the point at which you are being told that effectively your identity is nothing to be ashamed of and it can be viewed in a positive way, you're more likely to be comfortable with it. You're more likely to associate it with positive things, meaning the point at which you're then getting called out in a racist way, at the point at which you're seeing the society challenging you, we're more likely able to stand up to those challenging and not feel emotionally so shit because you already understand that some parts of your identity that you're likely to have are also positive. Lastly, we think it is more tangible, concrete benefits. We think that the world is often incredibly racist and it's very hard for minorities to fight against the stereotypes in areas that are deeply racist and so on. We think that they also do not have the burden principally to do that. The point at which they themselves are fulfilling some of the positive stereotypes is at least something good about the identity that other people believe in. The fact that you're being taught that you are smart and that you are and so forth probably means that you're more likely to display those characteristics and talk about them when you're discussing with other people. That means that when you're, for example, likely to be employed or in an interview or whatever, that you're likely to bring these things up. You're likely to be seen comparatively more positively than another individual from this minority. This is simply good for your career. It's simply good for you financially. Stand in proposition.
Okay, great. I think that's speaker and invite up the leader of opposition.
Can people hear me? Oof, laptop's about to die. That's no good. Also, is this round being recorded? No, right? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Is everyone ready? You will note that there's no positive stereotypes about white people because the default assumption is that they can do anything and it won't be seen out of place. What can we take from this? We can take that it's always a double-edged sword. If it does not hurt the child themselves because they cannot meet it, it makes them feel like it means that other people still can't do it. It means that there are people who, like, absent the ability to do this, first on OG's burden. Their case is rather simple. Their mech into empowerment to resist things is that this thing empowers children and then they can then resist stereotypes. So in my speech then, I'm gonna do a couple of things. First, I'll explain why it's bad for kids and doesn't empower them. Second, we'll be exploring preferable alternatives that don't have those harms. And then third, a bit of weighing why even if they prove it is empowering for some specific individuals, why it is that those stereotypes are on net bad for society. The second piece of framing is about the origin and what this will look like. Look, the government world in MEC is divorced from reality because it forces you to conceive of a world where minority cultures like the one that I come from do not subscribe to things like filial piety where parents are particularly strict. This is nonsense and probably shouldn't be a way you should conceive of the debate where they just do it the nice and best way. But even if they do, I'm not sure how that's possible. I'll explore that later. What it more looks like is Asian parents expecting their kids to be doctors, right? It looks like Black parents expecting that their kids like participate and spend most of their time in sports or things like this because of racist preconceptions that those are things that they are particularly good at. And that is the world they need to defend if this debate is going to be grounded in reality at all. The second reason why these stereotypes exist is often because white people propagate them to exoticize or essentialize race. So first then, why is this bad for kids? Two reasons. First, it limits their option set, especially for children with other passions or skills. The problem here is twofold. First, it puts an extra amount of stress on children who feel that they cannot meet these things. So this is why there are children who are literally throwing themselves in front of trains in the Palo Alto area parents because of oppressive filial piety structures, and then two, feel like because they are disappointing them at every turn, not meeting these positive stereotypes that were based in the original culture at first, this is what leads to that extra stress. I don't think reinforcing that is better. The alternative we propose is one that just says, like, follow the things you're good at, explore different things. We will base the amount of like love that we give you on the effort that you put in. I think that's rather simple. Secondarily, I think it's bad for kids because the jobs that they end up doing make them miserable. It looks like waking up with a midlife crisis at 40 and realizing you didn't want to be an engineer. You could have done something better that your talents or passions were more aligned to. I think that is not a life we would want for our kids. I think if people are A, less stressed, or B, doing jobs that they would make more money in, I think this actually lets them challenge stereotypes better because they don't have to deal with that. But before I move on, opening.
The circumstances that the kids are in, including things like schools, the friends, the other family and so on, are likely to push them to fulfill the more negative versions of the stereotypes. Your case is entirely non-comparative.
So if parents want to tell their kids not to do the negative stereotypes, we're fine with that. But you need to defend a world where they tell them to do the positive stereotypes. And I just don't think there are. So second question then, why are there no positive stereotypes? Why are they broadly bad for society? So even if they can prove it's empowering for some kids, it doesn't matter. One, stereotypes are a double-edged sword. Telling your kid that they're good at math implicitly reinforces the idea that they are then bad at things like English, right? Like, you can't say that you are good at this thing when the nexus of that thing is the idea that the child who was good at math is this nerd who was bad at other things. It deters them from doing those things. It makes them feel like they can't do, like, self-actualize. Secondarily, it leads to a homogenization of cultures. What does this look like? White people, when they're racist and stereotypical, don't just say, oh, that Asian guy is definitely Chinese, so he's good at math. This is really bad, right? Because Hmong individuals do not have the privilege that Chinese individuals do, yet they are still often held to these same preconceptions and standards. They ought to be really, really good at school and really, really good at math, and they don't often have the privilege to afford things like tutors, which oftentimes Chinese immigrants do. And this oppression that is homogenized across from them is also really, really bad for them when they can't reach these things. Third, the contrast to other groups is another reason why it is bad for you to live out these stereotypes. What does this look like? If you are an Asian and you show that you are good at math or that you are docile and kind and nice, like Asians are supposed to be, this then reinforces the negative stereotypes because you are used as a prop against Black and Hispanic people when they are said to be not docile, when they seem to be violent, when they seem to be not model minorities, right? So you can be doing the thing in the best way that the gov world wants. There's no way where you do it where you are not then used as a prop to then increase the impacts of negative stereotypes. And if you believe that the social perceptions of people are the things that govern them the most, this makes those social perceptions way, way worse. Fourth and finally, in the intersection of class, look, the poorest people can access this with things I mentioned earlier. Before I move on, closing government.
So this is also uncomparative, given that there's already a homogenous understanding of these groups, and these negative stereotypes are currently used to prop up these people against other minorities. So you need to prove that that actually changes.
Yeah. So we're not saying we solve the model minority myth or we deconstruct every single thing ever, but like, you're the ones who are being uncomparative, right? Because obviously in a world where you don't live out those specific stereotypes, you can then do other things, like when Boon Jong-ho wins an Oscar instead of winning a Fields Medal for mathematics, that in and of itself, or when Jimmy Lai gets arrested for protesting against the government, yeah, we don't deconstruct every stereotype ever, but these specific instances are people who can point to be things like, look, these are specific minorities who did things that don't align with the stereotypes about them, and they were able to do great things. So it is probably not the case then that you have to be like an Asian in order to succeed. Like, yeah, come on guys, be a little more comparative than that. Third, on alternatives, I think Tanae will expand on this a bit more, but come on, you can just like do things that white parents do that are great. Tell your kids that they have self-worth that is not based in those specific stereotypes, and then to build cultural identity, you can say that you are doing things that aren't through the nexus of the white eye, right? You can do things like say that you love your culture and you love being Chinese, not because you are good at math, but because you think the food tastes good, because you think that communitarianism and filial piety is more important than isolationism and only caring about yourself. The fact that we actually have a culture where you can have 20 people in a home and they all love each other is something that a lot of like white people in the status quo in America can't access. I want to deal with a beat. So I think at that point then, I just want to deal with a brief piece of extraneous rebuttal at the end. They say you're going to be seen as not normal. Look, I think that you're going to be seen broadly as not normal either way. You're not getting much from playing into this. So at that point then, it is unclear to me how unique this is. What you should be caring about though is being as like one, like A, not as choice restrictive as possible, and then B, making it such that your kids can actually, like if they're going to be seen as abnormal anyway, be seen as abnormal in the best way, that is in defiance of the existing norms rather than reinforcing the norms of abnormal. There are different kinds of abnormal. We would prefer you look like a preferable abnormal that isn't used to oppress minorities. For all of these reasons, proud to oppose.
Okay, great. I think that speaker and invite up the DPM.
Sorry, I'll just set up my papers for a couple of seconds. Thank you. Is everyone good for me to start? Just to check. All judges are good and good to go. Great. I'll start then in 3, 2. Oh, sorry. Did someone say something?
No, I was just saying you can start. I can hear you.
Ah, okay, great. Thank you. 3, 2, 1. As a parent from this minority, you know your child is not going to escape the stereotypes that are going to be thrown their way. They are going to be dealing with like peers who are like have problematic conceptions about them that are going to stereotype them either way. What you as a parent can make sure that you do is that you make that engagement as undestructive as possible. That you first are the one who controls the narrative about what that looks like. That when you get called a nerd in class, instead of feeling like this is something that means that you're doing something wrong and bad and you shouldn't engage in something that you are interested in, you think, ha, he's referring to the fact that like, you know, this is part of my identity, etc. But you can say like, oh, actually, it's because this is something that I'm pretty good at and I'm talented at. We feel that is a really important thing, especially for small kids, which like, note that there was no response from the previous speaker to Yona noting that most like kids that, you know, a parent is raising up are not like, you know, gender theory PhDs or something who are like able to like critically examine all societal structures and their like effect on their identity. Especially when it comes to young kids, you need to know that they actually like tend to engage with like group identities quite a lot. They tend to like perceive each other and kind of group each other based on things that are visible and or kind of different about people. And that means that you need to control those associations because you're never going to like really escape them. And even kids themselves tend to often like relate to these kind of characteristics even more strongly when they are like small. That means that you need to make it like as a kind of person who is most sympathetic, most nuanced, most understanding of that kid as an individual and able to know how you can make them engage in the most possible like way possible. You are like in that position need to control the way that engagement happens. And like that is something that is we think super important, especially when they like, you know, go to school and so on and interact with this more. How do I take a POI? Just do it, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So on both sides of the house, parents can encourage their kids with positive reinforcement if they're good at math. But what you need to explain is why it's so important to link that into the positive stereotype and say that you're good at math because you're Asian and you should embrace that.
So what we need to notice, firstly, we don't need to do it in an essentialist way, right? We don't need to say like this is something that is in your genes or you have to be this way or stuff, right? But this is often something that the kids firstly themselves often might associate with it, right? So things like also noting like the examples that Elo brought up in terms of things like filial piety, we're more communal, we care more about each other, we're less individualistic and kind of like selfish, like etc. These kind of minority culture, for example, is also a positive stereotype, right? So kind of often these are things that are kind of the kids themselves will associate with it, and we think at least it's something that like even if you're not directly associating with it, you need to like encourage them to kind of embrace that and say that that's something that is very cool for them to do and something that is positive. Also note that as a kid, if you are not encouraged or to embrace that, you will often take that as some kind of, especially in a context where maybe you're socialized to associate this with your identity, and you might kind of, for example, have like a society kind of expecting this of you. As a consequence of which, also note as a kid, you're more likely to have these properties because kids are very prone to kind of social encouragement. So that means quite a lot of kids will be interested in these things, you know, adhere to these values, etc. Like at the point where they are belong to these groups. That means that at the point where, as a parent, you're not encouraging them to embrace them, and you go like, you did your homework, or like, you shared with the community instead of taking things for yourself or adhering by some other identity value. Like at the point where you engage with that, even like in a neutral way, that is often taken by the kid as some kind of like, not perceiving that as a positive thing, right? And they will take that as a signal of that's something that, maybe is stereotypical for them to engage with, maybe they shouldn't be proud of, etc., which we think is something that is absolutely negative, especially given quite a lot of kids might actually be identifying with these things quite a lot. Like, and this is, we think, really negative in a lot of different ways. Also, like noting, like kind of answering to OO saying, like forcing people to, like kids to become doctors, etc. Know that, like, if parents are absolutely toxic, we think that we're toxic on either side of the house. We don't think that's a comparative this big. Like, are you like terrible to your kids and forcing them to be a certain way or not? Like, if you are forcing them in some kind of way, we think it's probably better to do it in a positive way. But secondly, like we think generally, like if we're making a comparative between who gets to define this stereotype and this identity for the kid, we think comparatively systematically their parents tend to be more understanding, more nuanced, and better than the kind of like wider society in terms of how they perceive this. So even if parents are not ideal, we think compared to other actors who would be getting to define this identity for them, they're massively, massively more positive. At this point, I'll take CO.
Do you not think that you create exceptionalism for minority children who fall out of positive stereotypes, because then it has a double-edged sword, because then it harms those who fall out of that particular positive stereotype?
So we don't think we generally do, for the reason that, like, as Fiona noted, we don't think you have to enforce this in cases where the kids themselves like don't identify with it. But secondly, we think you can always note that, there are people who don't kind of necessarily follow that exception or that value, even if, say, you encourage it in their siblings or something. We don't think that necessarily means that all kids will feel pressure to do this. You can say to them, yes, you're unlike the kind of other kids, you're for example, like more artistic or something, and that's completely fine. We don't think that's mutually exclusive with also saying, like, it's pretty cool for your group to be a certain way and for your kids to embrace certain values. Also then, like, what you need to note here is that when it comes to this kind of engagement, what they have with the stereotypes, firstly, we think you're far less likely on our side when you have encountered and kind of internalized these kind of like positive things to internalize negative kind of conceptions wholesale about your identity. Because we think often, like, part of what is most toxic about stereotypes isn't necessarily that there's kind of things that are assumed one way or the other, but the fact that your entire group and that entire identity is painted in a negative light and is something that you associate kind of as inferior and worse, and something that is kind of like negative, right? So for example, that you like a lot of like beauty stereotypes, etc., for example, for girls from like minorities. We think that is something that is kind of really important to overcome in terms of, even if certain things are stereotypical, it's better at least that you have some positive associations that you identify with at a personal level from your identity group, because that means that you're far less likely to internalize a wholesale negative conception, and you can kind of look at those positive things and say, these are things that are valuable and I cherish from my identity as a child. Secondly, we think where you kind of fulfill those stereotypes, like, which is quite important because quite a lot of people like do because of social encouragement, etc. Because often these kind of partially come from cultural like tendencies that exist, like for example, like being, your parents teaching you certain values and so on. We think that means that because there's like you actually need to have positive engagement with that to not feel like there's pressure for you to not do that, in order to feel like the things that are positive about you are not like lesser than anything else. We think as a parent, you need to recognize the fact that your child cannot escape these stereotypes. As a consequence, the burden is on you to make sure that they don't engage with it in the most toxic possible way. For which reasons propose.
Okay, great. I think that's speaker and invite up the DLO.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay. 4 pieces of framing, and then I want to get into, I think, breaking down this debate into 2 areas. First, on the direct impact to your child, but secondly, on the way that systemic impact generally generates from this kind of action. First, on what a stereotype is. I think opening government has a woeful understanding of what stereotypes actually are, because what they do is they conflate identity characteristics of minority cultures and stereotypes. The key difference is that stereotypes specifically are lenses used by the majority to view minority groups, whereas minority identity characteristics are often used by minority communities independently of majority groups to view themselves. So things like filial piety aren't positive stereotypes, they're just values that minority cultures often hold, because white people aren't looking at Chinese and be like, oh, he's filially pious. Like, that's not what people are thinking. The actual stereotype that people are holding is that, oh, that kid is going to be a scientist, that kid is going to be a mathematician, because that is how the majority group actually views them. But I want to give opening government a chance in this debate. So the second piece of framing I want to do is about, can stereotypes be purely positive? I simply don't believe that's the case, and they don't really interact with a lot of the matter that Dennis gives you. What we tell you is that stereotypes are double-edged in a number of ways. So first, even if the stereotype was purely, I am good at math, the implication then is that you are good at math and bad at English and bad at art and bad at other things. The reason that's the case is because it's seen that that is what your value is added to society, and that is what you ought conform to. So the problem here is that if you choose to do anything outside of that lens, then you're inherently at a disadvantage. I want to be a little bit more comparative here than what opening government did, because in a world where you tell your kid not to embrace a stereotype, you can still be good at math. You can have your kid say, look, maybe I am good at math, but it's not because I'm Asian, it's because I genuinely care about math. I think that's a very different way to present it. And I want to get to what Mila tells you a little bit later about why stereotypes will always exist, and actually challenge that premise and tell you that that's not actually likely to be true, but I'll get to that in just a little bit. The third piece of framing I want to do is that when you buy into a stereotype, you validate the white lens that people are looking through minority groups at. And I think that this is perhaps the most important piece of framing in this round. Because every time that I, as a minority group in the US, actually buy into a stereotype, it validates other stereotypes about me as well. That is, that if I'm a South Asian kid who is good at math and who does appear to be nerdy, then it does also reify those other stereotypes about me being socially awkward, about me not knowing how to interact in other ways, because the way that people view individuals is the most reductive way and most digestible way possible. It is not from a view of malice that people are actually looking at you, but rather one of misinformation and most simplified understanding. So if you confirm one input into that understanding, they just are going to assume the others to automatically be true, meaning that when you even buy into one positive stereotype, you're also automatically buying into all those negative stereotypes, even if you do buy the OG conception on the way that these stereotypes work. But fourth and final piece of framing I want to address is what the status quo actually looks like. Opening government seems to be living in a world where parents aren't encouraging their kids to currently buy these positive stereotypes. I think we live in a world where minority communities overwhelmingly make the mistake of forcing their kids to do this kind of thing. I don't think it's an accident my mom doesn't believe I have a real college degree because I'm not a CS major. The reason is simple. It's because that's what she views to be an actual college degree. That's what she actually values. And that feeds into that stereotype. She's like, yes, you are Indian, and as a result, you should be good at math. You should be good at the STEM field, and you should be sharing that and showing that view of yourself to other people. That is extremely dangerous. That is the status quo. On opening opposition, we want to move away from that version of the status quo. I'll take opening.
So So the burden for kids individually to associate these properties in a way where your parent says, oh, it's okay for you to do, but remember, it's not just because you're from this identity group that you are this way, etc. It's something that, you know, they will perceive as, okay, it's probably problematic for me in some way with regards to my group to actually fully embrace this, and or kind of put on the burden to not act out stereotypes, which is incredibly harmful and hard for like small kids to deal with.
Sure. So it is definitely difficult, and we don't disagree that for a kid who is good at math, who is Indian, for them to say, I'm just good at math and it's not because I'm Indian, that is difficult. But two problems with the argument. First, we would tell you that the vast majority of Indian kids who are in the US today, or East Asian kids, whatever group you want to apply this to, actually don't care about the same things that their parents cared about. The reason that these stereotypes exist is because when these immigrant communities came to the US, and usually in the mid to late 20th century, it was the easiest way for white people to actually view them as one homogenized group of people. That is, that the reason that you have the trope of Indian people as IT workers is because there were massive like IT contracts that were outsourced and insourced both to places like Bangalore in India, but also work that was brought over here as a result of that. That's why we have these stereotypes in the first place. We would say that they're no different than the other groups that already exist in the country, and that actually is an extremely harmful thing to do. But I actually want to address the thing that I said I would get to a little bit later, which is there possibly a world where these individual people can break away from the stereotypes that exist? And we would say that it is possible. Two reasons for this. First, we would say that the most important thing for us to acknowledge is that stereotypes currently, when they're applied by the vast majority of people, are from a place of a lack of information or ignorance rather than a place of malice. That is, that I don't truly believe that all white people want to view all Indian people or all Asian people or all black people as people who are inherently bad or inherently limited, but rather do that because that is all that they have been exposed to broadly. But if you present a view that is very, very different than what is ingrained in culture, that is, that if I say, no, I hate math, but I love art and I love other kinds of things that I'm not expected to like, it forces people to question those other stereotypes, which goes back to the second piece of framing about validation. That is, that when I disprove one of those stereotypes, it suddenly throws everything else into question and allows it to possibly actually escape those other kinds of stereotypes. Closing.
So the difference is, though, that in your world, people will always see individuals who violate these stereotypes entirely as being like integrated Chinese American, like in a dichotomy against people who are like kind of, as people would say, like fresh off the boat, or like bad stereotypes about someone who's like real Chinese, and therefore you're unable to get meaningful change for people who are deemed or identified as not part of the like American majority group.
Sure. So definitely an actual problem that people will have to face. But we would say that that world is definitely one that is far more preferable than one where you always view those people as fresh off the boat and as viewed as one group that is always lesser than the majority. Because the comparative is pretty simple, right? Like, yes, there's going to be a graying period, and there will be some people who are more easily able to assimilate, who may be called whitewashed or whatever the term you actually want to apply to it is. But we would say that that kind of integration is extremely important in the long run to actually having the wholesale immigrant group be considered part of one greater community rather than a distinct portion of the community that is lesser and less capable. So yes, there are growing pains, but on the comparative, it is the only way for them to actually ever be on an equal footing, not viewed through these dangerous lenses that they're already placed on by the majority. We're very proud to oppose.
Okay, great. I thank that speaker and invite up the member of government.
I'm going to be talking about two things in extension that will directly clash with the OO case. Firstly, a lot of framing about why the comparative is going to be worse kinds of coercion in the way that we force people's identity into, in a way that is more nuanced than the characterization that we heard from opening government. And then secondly, why we are better for generalized social utility of disenfranchised groups. On the first thing then, about why the comparative is likely to be worse forms of coercion, which is going to implicitly beat the OO case of like, it is bad to disproportionately force individuals into certain things. I think that without pushing kids into embracing positive traits, there are likely to be two competing forms of pressure on these kids that are substantially worse. The first form of pressure that opening government hits at but never fully explains is that with every one positive stereotype, there are 10 bad stereotypes that also exist for this particular group. Not only do we say that they're equal and that for one good stereotype, there's one bad stereotype, but we would say that the number of bad stereotypes is substantially more overwhelming. The structural reason for this that opening government misses is that dominant groups have all the power to shape social perceptions of these particular groups. You have absolutely no incentive to socialize and create perceptions of these groups in a way that are positive, because that's going to do far more to threaten your own power within society. So thus, for every stereotype that like an Asian kid is good at math, you have 10 bad things. So thus, individualized pressure that people feel to conform to bad stereotypes is substantially higher, because they're far more available in the public consciousness and are far more prominent within dominant media. The second kind of competing pressure that exists, aside from conforming to bad stereotypes, is there is also an overwhelming pressure to engage in forms of assimilation and to conform to standards of whiteness that are actually divorced from your minority group itself. This pressure exists for a couple of reasons. Firstly, even if these traits are a positive virtue per se, you're still an outsider from what the majority of people within society believe is normal. So you're an Asian kid who's good at math, that's fine, you're viewed as being intellectual, but you're so likely to get picked on by the majority of people within your class because you are different from how the majority of white kids are behaving. But secondly, standards of whiteness are simply the most elevated within our society at large, where things like media shows just emphasize these things substantially more because numerically speaking, these people make up larger groups within society. And the implicit framing clash we get from like OO is like, but you're still kind of creating a form of coercion here because you implicitly reinforce negative stereotypes as well. To that we say firstly, that is nonsense. Saying an Asian kid is good at math does not imply that they are bad at other things. You're just saying that you were slightly elevated, but like medium at everything else. But secondly, this is just a far lesser form of coercion and harm, insofar as you might slightly reinforce something negative when there are massive overwhelming forces that I briefly characterized. How then does this framing interact with the entire opposition case? Firstly, the entire argument that they make about coercion is a wash. If they say it's bad to like force kids to become a doctor, if they do not want that, we would say that there's still two other kinds of coercion that are going to exist. The comparative is then, do we prefer a kind of coercion that allows us to embrace positive traits, or do we prefer a negative kind of coercion? We would say that it is substantially better to force people to pursue things that are better and defer to the metric of social utility. I will frame the next argument. But secondly, it means that all of their arguments about intersectionality ultimately fall out. Because insofar as there's also pressure to conform to standards of whiteness, there are gaps about who in that minority group is able to do so the most effectively. Before that I get into our second extension, I will take opening op.
Obviously, what we told you was that stereotypes are not discrete, they're a caricature. So it's not like you can just be good at math. You are the whole package of what we imagine a stereotypical Asian to look like. That's why when you buy into one specific aspect of it, it makes it easier for you to reify and buy into the other ones.
Understood, but the comparative is also very overwhelming stereotypes about why these groups are bad for the exact same structural reasons that you give, and very overwhelming stereotypes about why whiteness is good, so that POI misses the extension. Secondly then, given I've already characterized why that coercion is a watch and we ought to defer to the metric of utility, what are the reasons about why we're better for individual success? Firstly, individuals on the ground are likely to make choices that are more likely to lead to success. Note, opening opposition never challenges the premise that individual children are impressionable and therefore going to listen to their parents, meaning that we can co-opt the impact. They're going to get a greater quantity of kids conforming to good stereotypes. This is actively positive because individuals are going to experience a greater material quantity of success when they do or when they conform to positive stereotypes. Firstly, negative stereotypes just like very intuitively lead to bad things, right? You're going to opt into careers that are less prosperous. You're going to adopt more negative traits, so then cause other people to perceive you worse and be less inclined to interact with you, meaning that you'll do things like have less advancement in your career and stuff like that. But secondly, conforming to standards of whiteness is something that is likely to fail as well, because it's something that is seen as being entirely unnatural for you. You're never going to be truly white. But what white people can get around is that you can be a good minority because they've literally constructed these positive stereotypes themselves. So we're looking to have things like do well in your career under our side of the house. This is good because individuals will access things like more financial resources and stuff like that, which is really, really impactful. I would posit this is a lot more tangible than OG's impact about less shame, because you also feel shame when you have less material success within your life, but they never actually explain why shame was a large impact. It's probably better if we allow you to have things like more money at the end of the day. Does CEO have a POI? Okay, the second reason about why more individual success is good is that this also helps you combat other negative stereotypes associated with your particular group. So if more people within your group like succeed in the labor market, we can also help combat other stereotypes that are associated with your group being lazy, which is a more effective mechanism than OG about how in the longer term you can actually get these stereotypes being overturned. The second way that we are better for the social utility of these groups is that we are better for how these groups are going to be perceived socially at large. In the same way that there's also coercive pressure with negative stereotypes being portrayed, you're you're more likely to be pigeonholed into other people, dominant groups viewing you through the lens of positive rather than negative stereotypes. Before that, OO.
Yeah, so both sides can advocating for pragmatism. Like we can say, yeah, you probably want to have a good job and stuff, but we don't have to say that the reason you do that is linked into your racial profile and the way that other people see you. Like,
understood. But if you buy into narratives of hard work rather than narratives of like you being a lazy or negative person, you're more likely to conform to those particular things and therefore actually be able to navigate successfully. So in terms of social perceptions, dominant groups are more likely to perceive you with positive stereotypes under our side of a house because firstly, you get a greater quantity of people from that particular minority group actively opting into positive traits. And the more people that you do so, you then start socializing other people within society to also perceive you in line with those particular kinds of positive traits. Even if there's only a few people, this can actually have a larger spiraling effect because they also have social networks as well. So you start to perceive immigrants, for example, as being hard work and conforming to the American dream. You will overall have a better perception of immigrants than on the comparative, where your default will be viewing these groups still in a coercive way, but more beholden to negative stereotypes. The impact of this is that in the long term, you're better for the rights of these particular groups. Your aptitude to support things like the welfare state and to help give these groups resources is contingent on how you view the inherent character of these particular kinds of social groups. When you view them being better, you're going to support positive kinds of political change far more. Also far more impactful claim than what we get from OG. Very proud to stand in closing government.
I think that's speaker for their speech and invite up the member of opposition.
Okay, panel, can you hear me? Okay, that's a thumbs up. Okay, I'll start speaking I'll do a countdown in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, 3 core questions in today's debate. Firstly, what is the role of parents and whether do we think that parents are, employing this motion prepares their children to be independent and exist within society? The second question is embracing positive stereotypes in the best interest of these particular children than themselves? And here we want to argue and explain to you that in the top half of the debate, they spoke a lot about, they didn't speak a lot about kids who fall out of that particular positive stereotype. And we want to problematize that analysis because it's particularly important, especially for the protection of those children within minority spaces. We think that was a flippant analysis in the opening half, right? The last question that we want to explore as exclusively as closing opposition is, does the motion achieve social reform of minority groups? Because we think that at the point at which we start embracing stereotypes, or at least expect parents to push the embracing of positive stereotypes, we need to see some active and beneficial, impactful change. We think that there's no analysis from the government bench in today's debate to explain that. Right? We think that even if stereotypes are positive, we think that there's much violence that emanates from that particular stereotype. And I think here we speak about, for example, the example that they gave us about Asians who are good in math. But what about those who aren't? We think that this question is particularly important because that particular child is harmed twice. One is ostracized by that particular minority because you fall out of the positive stereotype. But secondly, you get ostracized by the society because the stereotype exists in society. So if you're an Asian child who is not good at math, your Asian community says you are not for our stereotype. The society says you don't fit the stereotype. Therefore, you remain being disadvantaged at the end of the day. We think that the government is not in protection of the vulnerable actor here, which is the child, right? 2 issues that we hear from opening government. The first that they speak about, we want to challenge stereotypes and achieve a positive reinforcement. When I asked the POI about creating positive reinforcements, is that in addition to you then ostracizing the child that doesn't fit onto the stereotype, what you do is that then you create exceptionalism, right? So those who fit into the child, they are better minorities. Those who fit into the positive stereotype continue fulfilling that stereotypes to the disadvantages of those who do not, right? For example, when we spoke a lot about the colorism chat, and we say that lighter skinned people should not take positions or spaces of dark skinned people, because that is about positive. The positive stereotype is that black people can take spaces, but when black people, those who are closer to whiteness or those who are light skinned in color, take those positions to the disadvantages of dark skinned individuals. And we think that the danger in this is that it doesn't achieve positive reinforcement. What it does then, it takes on to another struggle, then puts off the person that falls onto the worst, the worst off, right? They even give an example about gays being good in wearing fashion. We think that is ridiculous, if anything, because that's what pushes femphobia, because now if you are more, I mean, you're not gay enough if you're not fashionable. You're not gay enough if you're not as flamboyant as the minority or the stereotype or the positive stereotype is supposed to do. Then we think we hate those exceptions and we think it's dangerous, especially for minority communities. Much of the engagement will come again in my speech. CG runs this analysis that, wait, we're going to combat other stereotypes, negative stereotypes that exist. To tell you here, panel, there's no mechanistic analysis to prove why this is true, even in the first instance, right? To think now, for them to recognize that negative stereotypes are problematic, we say then you exacerbate those negative stereotypes by then pushing positive stereotypes within communities that are harmful. We think that's particularly dangerous in today's debate. Not yet, guys, right? The second thing that they push is that they run analysis that dominate groups have power, especially in spaces of media, to push the stereotypes. And we say that's the danger. This is why, for example, dark-skinned women in roles have not been there. This is why, for example, Zoe Saldana was given the role to play Nina Simone, and she was questioned for the longest time to her, how are you playing a role of a dark-skinned woman when there's a dark-skinned woman actor or actress that exists? We think that those taking of spaces, the danger causes, it harms the minorities who exist within that particular stereotypes. 2 points of exclusive extension. The first is, I think we need to be sincere and give the characterization of minorities. The analysis here is that minorities are groups of people that are marginalized, right? But most importantly, they are constantly negotiating their way through life. What does this look like, right? It becomes a danger then when we allow parents of minorities to now push a certain stereotypes within that particular area, right? The danger here is that it puts the child in a position where they are now unable to negotiate the stereotype or interrogate the stereotype, right? The danger with this is that the danger of this, and it exists because parents are also authoritative figures who are there to push or teach, their children or form them for society. But additionally, children are formidable, so they take everything that their parents give in, right? So we think then this is why even for the longest time, black little girls do not understand why parents do not want other white children to touch your hair, right? I can hear you. And the last one is that therefore, because children are now in a formidable age, I think it's highly dangerous to expect parents as authoritative figures to push that analysis. Before I move on to the second piece of analysis, open government.
Thank you. Given a lot of kids from the minority are likely to identify with the positive stereotype anyway, when you are the one who defines it for them, you as a parent can present it in isolated and in absence of a negative part that OO said society will sell to them with. That makes it easier to resist internalizing the negative bits and overall to interrogate stereotypes about your group, because not all meshed into a mess where if you identify with positive, you necessarily also have to take the negative.
Okay, that POI is true, and that POI is not true because and this leads me to the last core question, which leads me to the extension that does this motion achieve social reform of minority groups? Because note that stereotypes shape and influence identity, which is something largely that was argued by CG, right? We think that the shaping and influencing of identity only works best if the individual actor who is involved in that thing is able to negotiate whether to buy into that particular identity or not, right? We think that that element of interrogation, that element of criticism, and the element of questioning whether that stereotype even defines them is taken away when parents as authoritative figures push this particular narrative. And then you then harm the socialization of the child, because children then don't exist under their parents for life. They have to go out of that particular space and then move into a space where then they have to exist within society. So now when you get to society and the stereotype is then pushed or is normalized, I think it's particularly dangerous for that particular child at the end of the day. What do we care about in today's debate, and what do we think is particularly important, right? We care about the well-being of the child, especially at their formidable years, right? But secondly, we care about that particular child that gets removed or that falls out of the stereotype. So that is most predominantly harmed, because that child is then not reinforced, because the positive stereotype doesn't affect or doesn't exist in their world. The danger with that is that then they face ostracization in society, they face ostracization within their communities, and therefore we're not good for that particular child. This motion must fall. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think that speaker and Veda pick up with.
Can people hear me? Yeah, okay, awesome. two themes to prove why we take this debate. First on the individual and then on the broader social group. But first I just want to clarify like what OG failed at most notably, because I think that they hint that other pressures exist. Like they say that there might be a flipped version of a certain pressure, but even if it's a 1-to-1 ratio of like you could either be a nerd or you could either be seen as like a studious person, probably that's not a huge impact, right? Like they never proved why there's overwhelming negative stereotypes, which I think we uniquely do this round. But I also think they never proved why that leads to coercion, right? This is the metric that the round should be judged on, because if people can freely choose what kind of stereotypes that they want to buy into, then presumably some negative stereotypes might exist, but it's not condemning to that individual, and they can probably break that norm to a certain extent. We uniquely explain why these stereotypes are, why negative stereotypes are the most coercive, and why it's impossible or very difficult to eliminate them, at least in the short term, which is also the reason why we beat OO, because their case is hung on like them being able to uniquely remove these stereotypes. Our analysis about the way that dominant groups get to craft these stereotypes is important because it proves that that is something that's at least very difficult to do, and therefore at the worst case we at least get some benefit of people being able to progress themselves within dominant norms. They needed to prove why that would change. I'll take you in a little bit. So on the individual, they say that stereotypes are a caricature, but stereotypes are an expectation, right? So this means that people cannot see you as like someone who's a valid, successful member of a group, and they probably get hostile to the way that you present yourself in that space unless they see you as someone who's within some kind of expectation that they have. So this means that, for example, like women who are trying to be advocates for themselves in the workplace, they are seen as hostile, or like Black women especially are seen as angry when they speak up for themselves. This means that unfortunately there is some kind of necessity for people to operate within that expectation. Otherwise, the types of contributions they make within those spaces are not seen as valid, not accepted on face value. I will take CO before I continue.
Whether the stereotype is positive or negative, we've exclusively shown you that there's a harm to the child. So why do you still want parents to push this narrative specifically to their children?
So I understand your case, and I think it's like probably one of the smartest things that we've heard in this round, but I still think that it fails to prove why you actually in your world get a reduction in these stereotypes being coercively assigned to people, right? Because if people cannot opt in and out, then it doesn't matter that there's some harm to accepting this if we could prove that you get some positive social change. So what is that positive social change, right? I think that you're probably seen by the people in your workplace as someone who's like, if you're Asian American, like willing to follow the rules and study hard, but also occasionally maybe you speak out once in a while, right? And when you do speak out, now people have to listen to you because you fit that expectation, you fit that perception. They're willing to validate your presentation within that space and therefore see you as a person who they can personally connect with, who's not like a total aberration of the expectations that they had. And I think that that means that you're more likely to grow close to people, to build these networks, to be able to establish your place within that workplace. Maybe in the future get something like a promotion because you're not like you're not their aberration of those norms to the point where you're like angry or seen as being like too vocal, right? So I think that means that you're more likely to get these people to listen to the things that you have to say, which means that you're more likely, for example, to, if you're like a Black woman, to gain a position of power in a workspace, which means that over time you're more likely to be able to reshape those spaces using the power that you're able to access by allowing yourself into networks of people who also have networks of other people who are more likely to see you as within something that is acceptable, to be able to slowly start like violating some of those stereotypes more and more, but in a marginal way in which people are willing and susceptible to the things that you do, and to the point where you're able to make your workplace, for example, if you're like a Black manager of a store, a bit more comfortable for people who are also of those minority backgrounds, right? Because you need to be in those positions of power, even if that's like a store manager and not like a politician, in order to be able to change those spaces to a meaningful extent, which is why we are the only team to prove that you get some margin of change on stereotypes. I also want to briefly weigh against this idea of internalized stigma, because I think if you're more socially accepted and you're better off materially, even to a minor extent, you're more likely to be taken seriously, promoted. This holds impacts on your ability to hold mental space to parse through that stigma, right? I think you're also more likely to have friends and people in your life who will listen to you and support you through the stigma, who are maybe people who belong to that majority group when those people are often like many in number in things like corporations. I think that also they like being able to conform to positive stuff, they never explained why that was something that was uniquely stigmatizing. Like that was kind of hung on the fact that this would be negative. They also didn't weigh the importance of internalized stigma. I just weighed that for you to say that at least you can, if you're better off somewhat financially or in a social situation, you can have better support networks to deal with the problem that will probably already exist. So on the broader social group, but first I'll take opening.
Sure. In practice, your case falls apart. Hispanic Americans have bought into the stereotype of hard work, but people still view Latino immigrants as fruit pickers, and they're still used to as a battering ram to deny welfare to Black communities all across the U.S., like Dennis pointed out. Is this the world you really want to live in?
Yeah, so I get your point. It's just not comparative, right? Because you didn't prove why that was likely to change. Again, I think I've already addressed this, right? Like you needed to prove why we don't get some kind of margin of difference. We're not claiming to solve racism. On the broader social group, they say that you can assume that you fit, they assume that you fit all of these stereotypes if you embrace one. It's unclear why this is true, first of all, and why this is different from the status quo. But I think, because I think that they do assume it anyways. But the difference, and I POI this very clearly, is that now you're able to be seen as an individual within the expectations of your group. So they're willing to categorize you as someone who is part of this group and not an aberration from that group. This is also refutation to CO, by the way, because their case is about some people fitting stereotypes and others getting left behind. But I think some people get left behind anyways because they're not being able to be seen as part of like the broader American or French or Canadian society because they are, for example, they don't speak that language super well, or they have some very visible signs of being a minority. This looks like recent Chinese immigrants being categorized into a different category of, for example, not being able to hold a job in like a white speaking world. We are the only team to prove that when one individual, for example, like who might be Chinese American, co-opts some of these stereotypes that are assigned to all Chinese people, they're more likely to normalize that and craft it in a way that is definitional to them. OG just says that you can choose what words define you. We go further than this when we explain why individuals are able to, for example, like be someone who portrays some of those traits very positively and maybe violates some of them in some rare circumstances, but then those kind of violations of the norm are normalized by people who hold more power within this minority group. So actually CO's case works against them because the people who have, like, for example, lighter skin are able to normalize some traits that are then cross-applied to other members of that group who are less well off. Overall, we're able to at least progress to some extent for people who were otherwise seen as immigrants who can never be seen as part of the broader social group, who could never allow themselves these economic opportunities. We're proud to propose.
Very great. I think that's speaker and invite up the op-web.
Hi, can you hear me? I just need to sort out my timer. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. But I don't see the thumbs up if they can hear me. Okay. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1, go. The problem with positive stereotype is that for the longest time, it hasn't allowed for people to fully exist in a society, especially in a society where you exist as a minority, where you're consistently placed in a position where you're negotiating your place in that specific society. What this has been problematic is instances where in the world where you can't even find solace on the basis that you have to fit a specific stereotype that is already conditioned and normalized in within society. I like the idea that in today's debate, we speak about the fact that there's a majority actor that is consistently trying to create these conditions of what constitutes as a positive stereotype. The problem with that is that firstly, at any point where you don't fit those expectations, it means that one, you're not palatable as an individual, and especially when they use the argumentation about how Asian people not knowing math simply means that they can't be palatable as soon as they enter into the workspace. We think that's the kind of positive stereotype or any kind of stereotype whatsoever that we don't want. The fact that individuals have to exist in a space where they have to fit a specific condition or a specific expectation. It's even worse because closing opposition is the only side that protects the most vulnerable act in today's debate, being the child. Because one, we think parents should not be normalizing stereotype, be it positive or negative stereotypes, especially in the formidable years of the child, because we think that that largely means that it informs their own identity and it still doesn't even allow them to exist in a world where they can fully accept themselves and how they exist. We think this is something that's very dangerous because we think as closing opposition, Mfumo justifies to you correctly how in the formidable years, the conception of your own individual and your own identity is largely informed by the things that are imposed to you in society. So it means that one, if Black Americans are considered to speak like better English than African people in the African continent, it simply means that you're saying that they fit that specific expectation of how like a Black person ought to speak, and if they can be given that sort of access. And this is something that we don't necessarily want. So we're going to tell you two things, and in my extension, and tying it and directly extending from what Mfumo told you. Firstly, we're going to directly expand from opening government in terms of saying that embracing positive stereotypes should not be the burden of the parents, and if anything, you are placing them in a position where the child can't fully accept themselves or how they exist. I'll take you at 3 minutes. So the first argumentation here that they tell us is that objective stereotypes should always be allowed into society because it means that you're trying to embrace, it means that you're trying to promote or accept the existence of particular individuals. They fail to prove or even respond to the most significant question in today's debate, because the question means that if at any point a person falls out of that stereotype, because it means that one, you're battling with the identity and the fact that you're always trying to negotiate your existence in the world. You're battling with the fact that you're a Black woman and already they're creating specific expectations for you. At any point where you don't even fit into that positive stereotype, where people say that, for example, that Black skinny women should look in a particular way, it automatically means that you're going to battle with that specific stereotype and the fact that you don't fit into that. Even worse for children who can't even dictate for themselves what is right or wrong at that particular point. We think that you're necessarily boxing them and putting them in a position where they have to take everything and allow for their own conception of their own identity to be largely defined by their own society. Before I continue, I'm going to take opening government.
You never respond to the idea that as an individual parent, you can never stop the child from internalizing stereotypes. On our side, you can at least choose the stereotype that the kid is best able to meet from the multiple stereotypes that you have about East Asian being both kind and having family values, but also being smart and so forth. We say to the extent that this would be about them being pushed into something, the kids are able to learn, therefore they're able to meet them in the vast majority of scenarios, but it is not about that.
That's the basic problem. It's an easy cop-out because what you're simply saying is that stereotypes are going to exist either way. So therefore, let's just force parents to normalize positive stereotypes. We think that isn't correct because firstly, you don't engage the most important question where a child falls out of that specific stereotype. But even worse, we don't think that parents should not be placed with the burden of normalizing or embracing stereotypes to begin with, because it means that at any point, you can't even determine what constitutes as a positive one or even a negative one. We think that you're largely not allowing those kids to exist in that specific society. The second other response to opening government's case is to simply say that people who exist for minority communities are people who are constantly on high alert. The fact that at any point they can be triggered, the fact that at any point society is going to question their own existence. What this simply means, and this ties exactly to what Mfumo responds to, that the objectivity that they're speaking about does not necessarily stand, because it means that even as a South African Black person, you are considered to be your English to be more palatable than any other person in the African continent. What it means is that you're only going to be acceptable on the basis that you fit. This is something that's very important on the basis that we ought to allow individuals to exist in a space where they can fully be able to understand their own identity without necessarily being told by their identity that they can't possibly accept. So what have we shown you here? Two things, because the debate that exists in opening does not directly engage to directly protect the most vulnerable act in society, doesn't speak about the protection of the child, especially in the formidable years. But secondly, it's also a debate that ignores the fact that parents are the authoritative figure, which means that at any point they have the responsibility to protect the child. But if at any point it harms the ability of a child to exist in a society where they're not necessarily allowed to understand their own identity, we think that we can't possibly accept it. Before I continue, I'm going to engage OG again.
Thank you. Know that when we talk about not internalizing these stereotypes, it isn't just some kind of vague kind of thing. It means that you can aspire to more. You dare to apply for top jobs. You see yourself as someone who deserves their fair place and share in society, like who is equally worthy to the majority. Like that is also why like the kind of practical impacts that CG talked about already flow logically from our case.
No, the problem with this specific stereotype is that it assumes the fact that at any point when you fall out, you can always aspire and try to be smart and try to fit in that specific stereotype. We think that's unfair for kids, especially to place them in that position where they have to know mathematics in order to fit into the criteria of what constitutes as an Asian person. If anything, that's an unfair burden because it means that if you consistently fail math, you are not necessarily going to be affected. And this is why your own criteria or your own model in today's debate does not necessarily protect the most vulnerable actor in society. So let's look at closing government, largely also responding to our core questions and indirect link to what they've told you. Firstly, what is the role of the parents? Secondly, is this in the best interest of social reform in terms of changing that socialization that exists in society? Thirdly, is embracing positive stereotype in the best interest of those particular individuals? One major thing that we get from outside closing government is the idea that we ought to embrace more positive stereotypes because there are more bad stereotypes than like a positive one. This is very dangerous and very problematic because we think that people are consistently trying to create counter public spheres where they allow for the existence of even different individuals or people who fall out of that specific stereotype. What you're simply saying under your model is to say that we ought to embrace that one stereotype over the bad stereotypes that are 10, which ultimately means that it defeats the entire purpose, especially in instances where the child does not fit into that specific criteria. Closing opposition is the only side that does the most important work in today's debate. One, the work of trying to protect the most vulnerable actor in society, but also the only side that justifies that the role of the parent is not necessarily to embrace or force positive stereotypes on those kids. With all those weights, I've never been proud to oppose.